RBs are the backbone of every fantasy football roster, and today let's look at my personal Dynasty RB tiers and kind of talk about the strategy that I deploy when I am trying to build a successful Dynasty roster. So the first thing to go into it, I feel like I think about RBs a little bit differently than other positions. At a high level, RBs have a very short shelf life, but they also make probably the biggest impact on your roster. So the important thing to think about when rostering running backs is you want to get as many shots on goal, whether they're at different tiers. So a lot of positions, you want to just get the best guys you can. But running backs aren't always this way. A lot of times their situation changes. Players go up and down based on new coaching staffs, new players they draft. Whereas elite wide receivers, elite wide receivers and quarterbacks, they usually don't lose their job to some random, coaching staff change or something like that. Anyway, this will be kind of a high level overview of what I think. I don't want to go into too much details or throw too many numbers at your face. Just because there's a lot to talk about, but I also don't want it to go like 40 minutes. So let's jump into it and look at the first tier. So the first tier is the tier that everyone has, right? It's the elite young running back tier. So the kind of how I describe this is a elite running back that has age on his side, meaning they're young, newly drafted. The franchise is very heavily invested in this player, and they're usually tied to a high-producing offense. Currently, I have 4 players in this tier. This was Bijan, Gibbs, A-Chain, and Breece Hall. So something to consider right now. Bijan is RB1 on KTC, Gibbs is RB2, A-Chain is RB4, and Breece is RB5. All of them have scored over 200 points. Even someone like Breece, who has kind of had a down year, and all of them are 23 years or less. So that's kind of the criteria of this, tier, is you need to be scoring high number of points and also have that age upside. The way I like to think about it is if these players get injured, are people panicking, right? If they have a significant injury, are people completely out? This is the only true dynasty asset at the running back position, is this top end tier. Outside of that, any injury would tank any of these guys' careers. So that's kind of how I approach it. One thing to consider is I do think players like A-Chain and especially Breece Hall next year will kind of lose that shiny veneer they have and fall into tiers below. And I'll kind of talk about the 2 main tiers that happen once you hit a certain age cliff. I don't want to say players become useless, but there is an age cliff where you do have to consider running backs differently. Okay, next tier is what I call the elite producers tier. And this is frankly where some of the best value is at the game. So players in this tier are obviously the big names, right? Saquon Barkley, Kyron Williams, Kenneth Walker, James Cook, Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry. But I also put players like Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, Monty, and also CMC. I would still put CMC in this tier. These are players that are also putting 200 plus points, including some like Barkley and Derrick Henry, who are RB1 and RB2 this year, but they are past that age prime where people get scared. And me personally, I don't really care. I don't really care about age. I think it's a great idea to tear down in leagues that aren't super shallow from like a Bijan to get a Barkley plus or something like that. Locking up elite production at the running back position and future picks is the key to Dynasty. And that's why there's a lot of value to be held in this tier and a different tier I'll mention. The players in this tier are still producing at a high level, and typically they're not super old. Some of them get to a higher age, like a Henry or a Kamara, but frankly, I don't really care. Like if you're scoring, if you're producing, if you're a key part of the offense, and you're getting me 200 points a season, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're 30. It doesn't matter if you're 25 or 22. Like, I want that on my roster. And we also see different running backs fall off at different ages, right? I mean, Alvin Kamara is 29 and has 231 PPR points, right? He's currently sitting at RB21 on KTC. I mean, screaming buy. He's still a screaming buy. Obviously, his injuries recently, he might not be a buy right now, but I'm not panicking on players like that who have shown, even at an older age, like a Derrick Henry, they can produce. The next tier is the smallest tier, in my opinion. These are kind of what I call the rising stars, right? They do have the age bump, but they don't necessarily have the complete buy-in from their organization, and or they don't have elite production, right? Players like this are like Tyrone Tracy, Chase Brown, and Bucky Irving. All three of these players are extremely young, have shown flashes. They've had stretches where they are really scoring well, but they're in some odd situations. For example, Bucky Irving has a lot of good running backs around him, right? Rashad White's pretty solid. Even Sean Tucker sometimes gets some usage. But Bucky Irving is probably the one I feel the most confident in. Chase Brown has been killing it recently with Zach Moss going out. Looks really good. Tyrone Tracy is a player that should be getting more usage. I don't know why they were splitting him with Singletary last game. There's probably going to be a coaching change for the Giants as well, and we don't know if Tracy's going to shuffle out in that mix. Another thing to consider is these rookies could also get impacted by the 2025 rookie draft class, as there are a lot of high-end running backs that are going to be available. So I could see Cincinnati or the Giants investing in one of those positions, and then they kind of become solid producer upside, but not that elite level. And that's one reason why I separate these two between the rising stars, elite producers, and the elite young players. I don't feel like Bucky Irving is an elite young player, but I also don't feel like Bucky Irving is an elite producer. He's shown flashes. He can certainly get there, and I would rather have him over the players that I mentioned in the next tier. But there's still some uncertainty to where I don't know if these players are long-term investments that could get into an actual elite young tier dynasty asset. Next is one of the bigger tiers. So I'm not going to name all the names, but this is what I call the solid producers tier. These are players where it's like, okay, cool, I have you on my team. I feel confident in. These are players that are past the age prime, right? Similar to the elite producers tier, where age isn't something that people really look at as a good thing. Some players in this tier are Isaiah Pacheco, Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson, Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, Najee Harris, Rashad White, James Conner. The types of players that you can kind of get for like a second and a third-ish range. This is one of my favorite tiers in all of Dynasty. I feel like there's always bargains to be had, especially when one of these players has a couple down weeks. People get scared. People freak out. Ultimately, I want to have multiple guys in the elite producer tier and the solid producer tier. All these guys are going to put up solid numbers. Sometimes they will crack RB1 weeks, such as like Aaron Jones this year has outperformed what I expected, or like James Conner. But still, like, there's uncertainty a little bit in their situation, and they also have the concern of, if James Conner has a significant injury, he's not a guy that I feel confident in as sort of next year getting a lot of usage. Similar to, Nick Chubb pre-injury, I would probably put Nick Chubb as a elite producer, but he suffered a bad injury and fell all the way to basically irrelevant. So that's kind of how both the elite producers, but especially the solid producers tier is played. If there's an injury, it can really impact their outlook long-term. I do want to have a lot of these guys because the situation impacts these players a lot. For example, last year I would have put Joe Mixon and Josh Jacobs in this type of tier where they are solid producers, but I'm not ever like, thank God I have Joe Mixon. It's just like, okay, cool, I can plug Joe Mixon in and feel good. But the reality is now Joe Mixon's situation changed and he's producing elite numbers. So it's not technically a talent issue. A lot of times it's situational. And for that reason, I feel like a lot of these players are great bargains if you can get them because situations change all the time. And if it does trend the right way and they land in a good spot, you could see them jump up into that elite tier where you're like, wow, they get an RB1 season. And all I did was, trade a second. Now it's time to get a little crusty. We're looking at handcuffs. This is the handcuff tier. Not anything super exciting. This is a massive tier of running backs. And basically any running back that you're going to pick in a second round or later in a rookie draft, kind of in this tier until they show anything. For example, this is kind of where Bucky Irving was before Bucky Irving got some run and we actually got to see that he's worth something. Players in this tier are Jonathan Brooks, Blake Corum, Trey Benson, Jalen Warren, someone like a Jerome Ford, Tajay Spears, Braylon Allen, Tank Bigsby, Marshawn Lloyd. Chardonnay. So it's like a lot of these players that just don't have the opportunity, frankly. This is very situational based. It's not talent based. A lot of them is Trey Benson got drafted, but James Conner's crushing it. I can't really start him, but I also don't want to write him off. This is another tier to definitely have a lot of, especially if you can get a lot of them for cheap. If you have a deeper bench, you do want to have some of these guys because you can get them for cheap as throw-ins here and there, or even pick them up off waivers. And these players are someone that, again, situations can change. New coaching staffs can come in. For example, Kendre Miller is a perfect example of a guy that was buried in the handcuff tier, but now that the coaching staff is kind of shuffled up, he's going to get some usage, especially with Alvin Kamara getting banged up. I expect him to actually be somewhat relevant, but this handcuff tier is certainly a valuable player, but it's not anyone that I'm super excited to usually get. If anyone wants someone in the handcuff tier, I'm willing to trade them. If I can get someone else in the handcuff tier in like a third, right? It's kind of a game of let me nickel and dime, pick up a little bit of value here and there because people like Jonathan Brooks or Blake Corum or someone like that. The last main tier I have on here is the do they see the field tier. These are the real crusties. These are the ones where I don't really care. They don't really have any value. But if it's week 14 and all my players I'm by, fine. I'll start Gus Edwards. I'll start Ezekiel Elliott if the sky's falling. Raheem Mostert, it's hard to write him off because we saw what he did last year, but this year he hasn't been great. Nick Chubb, sorry about his foot, but kind of those range of guys where it's I just need them to hit maybe 9 points and not screw me over. Are they on the field? These are players that are kind of you churn at the bottom of your roster. If you can get any value for them, you take them. And it's to me, it's kind of what happens if you have a handcuff tier player that fails or a solid producer that kind of ages out of being locked into a situation where they can produce, right? For example, Zach Moss after Chase Brown took over and the injury. Zach Moss, do they see the field? Maybe I'll buy him. Someone like a J.K. Dobbins when he was injured forever, right? He was injured for like 3 years. He's kind of just like, do they see the field? Then I'll care about him. In general, it's not a tier to really worry about. If you can get value from them, sure. But in general, it's just another body. If they're on their roster, cool. So that kind of covers the tiers I have and the way I kind of look at things. When it comes to Dynasty, I really feel like the running back position kind of is the most redraft of them all. I just really want to take advantage of the short-term memory everyone has and try to say, hey, Brian Robinson's doing good for 3 weeks. Can I flip him and get Aaron Jones in a second because Aaron Jones hasn't done well? Because in my opinion, the situations can change quickly. Offenses and schemes change quickly. I'm not going to invest a ton into certain running backs. I do think if you get someone that's elite, if you have the Barkleys, the Henrys, they can really win you a season, and that's the fun of the running back position, is taking all those shots on goal, hoping that you hit on this year's Josh Jacobs or Joe Mixon. And that's why I think, personally, the solid producers range and the elite producers range is an amazing tier to invest in because you do have the upside of players that are just, frankly, going to score more than a lot of the elite young players. Everyone goes on to, Dynasty Daddy and looks at the top-ranked RBs, and it's never really Saquon Barkley or Joe Mixon or the guys that are actually scoring. And this is one of the few positions where age and everyone gets scared of their Todd Gurley, but sometimes you just got to hold the bag because if you have a solid producer and the situation rolls the right way, they're going to get the usage that you need to actually score. Anyway, that wraps up everything. And before I go, I will say I probably will take a few weeks off because of the holidays. I hope everyone is doing well in the playoffs. I know we're getting to the semis in some leagues. And I just got knocked out of Scott Fishbowl, so I'm trying to hang in on the leagues I'm at. But make sure to set your lineups, and I will see y'all after the break.